Yeah. Mm. Yes, go ahead.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first webinar of the Clingendael Russia and Eastern Europe Center for 2021 on a topic that was high on our agenda last year when we asked ourselves before the elections in Belarus if it would be a hot summer ahead. And I think it's fair to conclude it wasn't only a hot summer afterwards, but also a very stormy autumn and unfortunately a very harsh spring as well. And now at the start of a new year, it's a good moment to ask ourselves the question what 2021 will bring to Belarus. And I'm honored that we can organize this webinar together with the two embassies of Poland and Lithuania to the Netherlands. And before we start with the substantive part, I'd first like to give the floor to Ambassador Purlis and Ambassador Ciepelak of Lithuania and Poland. Ambassador Purlis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bob, and good afternoon and welcome to all participants. I'm delighted that the Lithuanian Embassy could contribute to organizing this event on Belarus, our important European neighbor. We all remember that in August, Belarusian people spoke in favor of change towards democracy, rule of law, and respect for human rights. That is fundamental values that we stand for in Lithuania and share in the European Union. And Belarusian people, up to this day, demonstrate that they will peacefully fight for their choice, for their democratic choice. However, the illegitimate regime in Minsk wants to deny this right by brutal force. Lithuanian government and public for decades supported civil society of Belarus. We do even more now because we think that the voice of Belarusian people needs to be heard. We want Belarusians to discuss their future freely. It is for them to decide what future they want. Therefore, we give refuge to Belarusian political organizations, human rights defenders, host independent Belarusian university, and other democratic institutions. It is also important that we are united and active as EU, supporting civil society of Belarus, demanding release of political prisoners, and free and fair elections. Also continue with sanctions against those who perpetrate crimes of persecution, torture, and other crimes. The Netherlands plays an important role in the EU, and it's important that we have this discussion in The Hague today. And for this, I would like to warmly thank the Clingendael Institute, the Center for Russia and Eastern European Studies, the Embassy of Poland, and the Ambassador, of course, my colleague, Marcin Ciepelak. Thank you.
Marcin, Ambassador, up to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Belarus, Lithuania, and Poland, we are so close. We are bound by our common history. Poland and Lithuania are members of the European Union. Belarus is a very important EU partner, also a participant of the Eastern Partnership. The sovereignty of Belarus is a key issue for us, as are people-to-people contacts and economic cooperation with this country. The processes taking place in Belarus significantly affect the international environment and our close neighborhood. The latest developments in this country in the context of presidential elections in August last year cause our deep concern. The human rights are now under enormous pressure. Mass protests calling for free and fair presidential elections and a genuine and inclusive national dialogue are continuing. Belarusians can count on our support, care, and hospitality. But the Belarus path ahead remains uncertain. Perhaps this webinar will be able to at least partly unveil the future of this nation and its country. And this is why I'm very proud that Polish Embassy to the Kingdom of the Netherlands is one of co-organizers of this seminar. I would like to thank everybody who made this possible, especially Clingendael Institute. I wish you all fruitful and comprehensive discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ambassadors, for your kind words. And it's a pleasure for us as Clingendael Institute that we can serve this purpose to be also a bridge between your respective governments and the Netherlands. And I encourage everyone to reach out to us if you want to work with us in this capacity, because it's important for us to be able to bring the expertise that exists in the region also to the Netherlands, so that this perspective can be heard here. We have a very full program today. Let me very briefly talk you through it and also mention the speakers for the first part, because we will start with a keynote introduction by Pavel Latushka, who is a member of the Presidium of the Coordination Council of Belarus, one of the prominent leaders of the opposition, and also head of the National Anti-Crisis Administration. And before that, he was the Minister of Culture in the Republic of Belarus from 2009 to 2012. And served as ambassador, among others, from 2019 to the French Republic, to Spain, to Portugal, and to UNESCO. He will give us a few insights on the current state of affairs, the current assessment also of the opposition, of some of the proposals that have been floating around, because Aliaksandr Lukashenka has mentioned certain things that he wants to engage in constitutional reform, maybe even put something to a referendum this year. And it's important for us to understand also here in the West, on how we should assess this, how genuine this process is, and also what the opposition would like to do. We will then have a perspective from the Republic of Poland that will be given by Jan Hoffman, who is the director of the Eastern Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also a former member of the European External Action Service. And he can give us this diplomatic perspective from Poland, which is one of the countries that has been pushing most, together with Lithuania, to have this on the EU's agenda. After that, there will be an opportunity for you, dear audience, to ask your questions. So let me tell you very briefly how that works. You have a button in the Zoom, for those of you that are on Zoom, where you can type your questions in the Q&A. I will pick up those questions and I will distribute them to Ambassador Latushka and Mr. Hoffman, respectively. And then we will have about 15-20 minutes for that. Then we'll have a brief break to switch speakers, and we'll come to the second part of the webinar when we discuss more from an expert perspective, the stability of the regime, the expectations that we have going forward, and also, incredibly important, the geopolitical dimension, which we'll do with Vitas Jurkonis from Lithuania and Tony van der Tocht from the Netherlands, whom I'll introduce in more detail after the break. For those of you that are on YouTube, unfortunately, you can't ask us any questions at this point. But do register on our website for future events, then you can participate in the Zoom, where we have at this moment, I think, 64 attendees. Welcome to all of you. I do want to make one other remark, and that is that the composition of today's panel does not entirely reflect, or doesn't reflect, the incredibly important role that women played in the protests in Belarus. We do try at Clingendael Institute to have all our webinars inclusive in many ways. Nationality, we had 4 countries to deal with, but also from a gender perspective, and we will continue to do so in the future. I just wanted to acknowledge that. Now, Ambassador Latushka, if I could be so free to give you the floor and ask you, as someone who has been involved from the very beginning in the opposition, as someone who took the courageous step to join the Coordination Council, who has reached out to the regime to try and have dialogue, who has reached out also to the Russian Federation for a dialogue. You've tried many things, but many of these attempts have been in vain, and I understand that just last month, you were among those in a case by the Prosecutor General for extremist activities. So I wanted to ask you, is any dialogue still possible at this point? How do you look forward to 2021, in particular to those ideas mooted by Aliaksandr Lukashenka on constitutional reform? Do you see any possibilities to engage with that? And also the international dimension. How do you assess the role that we in Europe, but also the Russian Federation, could play in achieving that aim that you have fought for, namely a peaceful transition of power? Ambassador, thank you for your time. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dzień dobry, labadiena. Dear colleagues, Your Excellencies, thank you so much for this great possibility to make our presentation during this conference, for the initiating of this conference today, which is a good possibility to share with you the views on the development of the events in Belarus on behalf of the National Anti-Crisis Management, a political structure which was established by the Coordination Council of Belarus, with the objective to ensure the smooth transition of power after resignation of Lukashenka. Let me introduce also my colleague, Ambassador Vladimir Ostapenko, my colleague, ex-Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador in several countries. We will participate in this meeting together. Since the presidential election held on August the 9th, 2020, which were brutally falsified by the authorities, many foreign leaders and organizations have expressed their rejection of their results and finally refused to recognize the legitimacy of Lukashenko. Now we can state that the regime of Lukashenko has ignored all the calls made by the European Union Council, European Parliament, High Representative Mr. Borrell since August 2020, as well as the OSCE recommendation, UN and United Nations Committee of Human Rights resolutions, individual declarations of the political leaders of foreign countries with demands to stop violence and start a political dialogue. We have to admit that the imposed European Union sanctions do not produce any results which could significantly affect the activities of the illegitimate regime. Back in November, the National Anti-Crisis Management predicted that the absence of the urgent external actions would lead to more political prisons and violence, criminal sentences for political protesters, increased forced migration, and this could make Belarus a destabilizing factor in the Central and Eastern Europe. Unfortunately, this prediction has come true. The latest figures show that the number of the political prisoners has reached 183. Today, 5 people more, 5 journalists. The courts in Belarus sent the protesters to jail for a slogan, "We do not forget," on the sidewalk, for using the mobile flashlight in the courtyard for the Scandinavian voting, imposed huge fines upon 90-year-old woman for using the national white red flags. I could go on for hours with the examples of this madness and stupidity that have become the part of our daily life. With the closed borders, the Belarusians and many local companies are planning their relocations to the other countries at the earliest convenience. And we are confident that this terror will definitely continue while the people of Belarus will be fighting for the democratic freedoms and the right to elect in genuine leaders. In view of the above mentioned, the National Anti-Crisis Management deems it prudent that the fact the situation in Belarus should be considered a priority for the European Union in 2021 and needs a united and coordinated response along the following lines: to set up the European Union high-level mission for further mediation and democracy support activities, to launch a targeted European Union assistance program to help victims of political repression and police violence, to consider lowering the level of diplomatic engagement of the European Union member states with Belarus, and or the recognition of the people's embassies of Belarus abroad, to take measures to counter the disinformation on the situation in Belarus and concerning the European Union and its member states. The second, the National Anti-Crisis Management supports the proposal of the European Parliament to establish a representative mission of the Coordination Council of Belarus in Brussels, to be accredited to the European Union institution with a view to contribute to the effective coordination of the joint efforts and pave the way for the democratic changes in Belarus. That said, the National Anti-Crisis Management still believe that a peaceful and democratic solution to the Belarusian crisis should be sought through an inclusive national dialogue with broader society, in particular the Coordination Council, which may be facilitated by the OSCE chairmanship in office. The fourth, special attention should be given to the procedures that might ensure the implementation of the recommendation of the OSCE Moscow mechanism, a reporter, including the creation of an independent international body, tribunal, for the in-depth investigation of human rights violations. The fifth, the National Anti-Crisis Management is convinced that all the European Union political initiatives towards the illegal Belarusian regime should be supported and accompanied by the preparation of the list of effective and target sanctions against the leading state-owned entities and oligarchs close to Lukashenko. This list may include the Russian citizens responsible for or involved in grave human rights violations, abuses and corruption. The proposal for such sanctions could be used in close coordination with international partners as a threat or lever to enforce a serious, credible and inclusive political process resulting in free and fair elections under the OSCE observation. The sixth, at the same time, the National Anti-Crisis Management encourages the European Union to continue its work for the introduction of the European Union sanctions against individuals responsible for the falsification of the election results, violence and repression, dismissing the employees and students for participations in strikes in Belarus. We are ready to fully cooperate with the competent bodies of the European Union and its member states in order to provide the necessary information or a substantial number of both high and middle-ranking officials who are directly involved in supporting the Lukashenko regime in Belarus. Last but not least, some lawyers believe that the actions of regime of Lukashenko may be considered as those falling into the definition of an offense of terrorism within the meaning of the International Convention of the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism. There it is defined as any other act intended to cause death or serious bodily injury to a civilian or to any other person not taking an active part in the hostilities in a situation of armed conflict when the purpose of such act by its nature or context is to intimidate our population or to compel a government or an international organization to do or to abstain from doing any act. The National Anti-Crisis Management is ready to initiate the public and legal debate on this matter in search of corresponding political decisions. About the so-called constitutional reforms, which are plans by the Lukashenko regime, I'd like to ask my colleague, Ambassador Vladimir Ostapchenko, to tell several words.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief.
Please, Ambassador. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Because in general words, we characterize this situation as very, very unpredictable. because there are many promises to start the constitutional reform, but till the moment, no one has any idea of how this constitutional reform could develop. We are on the eve of the so-called All Belarusian National Assembly that will be held on February 11-12. And initially it was announced that this assembly could take a very drastic decisions on its role in the constitution and the possible changes to the constitution. But then finally it was announced that no serious decisions shall be taken at this forum, and all the decisions, possible decisions, are postponed till the end of the year, where they will be put on the national referendum. We realize that the authorities for the moment have no way out from this political deadlock, because any public initiative, any referendum that they may hold would mean that they would spark once again all the protests that are now, after the repressions, kept a little bit low, and all the actions that they take are directed at postponing to the maximum level all the decisions that could be part of the solution of the political crisis. We are confident that the only feasible decision and real decision to the political crisis should be the holding of a new and fair elections, and all cosmetic changes to the constitution does not serve this purpose. So here, in the conditions of unpredictability, we shall wait and see, and we shall react on the events as they happen, because if this Congress could take any decision on this matter, that would entail the reaction from the our side, from the people of Belarus, from the international community. We expect, if no decisions are taken at that moment, then it means that we still are in the period of indecisiveness and without any clear picture of how this political crisis could be settled by peaceful means.
And if I can ask a quick follow-up question, Ambassador, is there any opportunity for, maybe not the Coordination Council, because it's clear that the Prosecutor General has taken a stance, but for the opposition in general, for the different movements that exist, to still use this process of the All Belarusian Assembly for the purpose of exercising pressure from below on the regime to open up? Or is that completely out of the question in the current situation?
Sorry, it was completely excluded by the convenient decision of the president, because that's the next Congress that he is already being organized.
Yeah.
In previous 5 cases, there were sort of a procedure, democratic procedure, to put forward the delegates, that they were elected at the different factories or by different population gatherings, by trade unions. Now it's completely nomenclature driven, because all the delegates are basically appointed among the local authorities.
Okay.
And no opposition figure could appear there as the representative of the Belarusian people. So that this possibility is completely excluded by the procedures to nominate the participants of this event.
Thank you. Yeah, it's not good news, but at least it gives us a bit of clarity on what we can expect from this process.
The 2 deputies of the Minsk City Council, which were against of the violence on the streets of Belarus in Minsk, they are excluded to participate in so-called National Congress.
Yeah. Okay, so through the choice of who's allowed to be at the table, he has basically already preset the outcome, and he has made it impossible to engage in a meaningful dialogue with you and all those other forces within Belarusian society who want more change. That's very clear. If you permit me, I would now like to move to our second speaker, but there have been certain questions already posed in the Q&A, and I encourage everyone to make use of that option. So we will return to you shortly, but I would like to move to our second speaker on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland, Jan Hoffman, who actually had to step in on behalf of the Undersecretary of State, Marcin Przydacz, who couldn't make it because he had to attend an urgent cabinet meeting on COVID-19. So Jan, I'm very grateful that you're able to join with very limited preparation, I may add. You are you're the director of the Eastern Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You're also a former member of the European External Action Service. So I think you're well placed to reflect on what Ambassador Latuška and Ambassador Ostapenko have just told us, and also to give us a little bit of insight on what Poland thinks should be the next steps, and also when it comes to this constitutional reform process, if that is in any way something we could engage with in one way or another. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you for the introduction. And because of you, I have to apologize twice. Not only am I not Minister Przydacz, I am just replacing him. I apologize to everyone for not being Minister Przydacz. I am no woman as well, as you can see. So apologies, double apologies. Ladies and gentlemen, but thank you very much anyway for sustaining this situation. And thank you very much to both my predecessors, both ambassadors, as well as to Ambassador Latuška and Ambassador Ostapenko. Thank you very much for your words and very concrete proposals. And this will allow me to start by saying two things which are the basis for any assumption we're making on the future of the situation in Belarus here in Poland, and maybe more broadly in the European Union, as this perception is shared among other EU partners as well. First and foremost, as you could hear and see just 30 seconds ago, the civil society in Belarus has played and will play a tremendous role in this peaceful, let's hope, transition. And this is self-explanatory and seems obvious, but let me remind everyone that just half a year ago, we would read in any analysis that the civil society in Belarus is so apt to Russification, and after 20 years of Lukashenko's regime, and after 50 years of USSR domination, there is no real perception of nationhood and no real civic engagement. I think that the two gentlemen who were speaking just before me proved to you, as well as all of the news and the pictures we have seen during those half-year period, that we were completely wrong, and that the Belarusian civil society is there, is active, and it's our utmost necessity to support this activism and this engagement that was sparked by the fraudulent elections in August. So that's point number one. Point number two, Rome wasn't built in a day, which means that we need to see this in a process. Coming from Poland, the country that was fighting for its independence for at least 50 years under the Russian domination, we know what that means. And of course, I can understand the hastiness and the willingness of political actors in Belarus now to seek a solution as soon as possible. But it might happen that we need to prepare ourselves for a long Chinese march as well. This entails very concrete decisions that we need to make among like-minded countries, EU member states, and NATO allies. We need to brace ourselves in supporting Belarusian civil society, one, and we need to listen to it. And that is why I want to thank the organizers for the possibility to speak to you, but of course, for the possibility to listen to Mr. Latuška and Mr. Ostapenko, who you could see have very clear proposals for the European Union and the international community on how to proceed with the way forward. But as we see that the situation of President Lukashenko, especially of Aliaksandr Lukashenko, especially politically, is becoming weaker and weaker and more uncertain, we need to sustain the situation on our side by providing assistance to everyone that needs it. Second element of the Polish thinking is that we need to look at the long term, which means we need to be ready as the European Union to show a clear path of assistance should the transition in Belarus commence. This is why Poland and a few other countries have proposed a democratic or an economic plan for a democratic Belarus that should be there on the table once Belarus starts its road to democracy. Third element, we need to take into account the voice of the civil society and make sure that the regime in Minsk understands that. So we may call it National Assembly or Congress, but it should not take any decision that will be accepted by the international community unless the Belarusian civil society is part of the process and accepts the outcome of this process. And this is also a very clear message that has been passed to President Lukashenka when he was still active, that he should launch a national dialogue, but it should be an inclusive one with all of the political factions and all of the opposition which appeared to exist in Belarus, no matter what we thought or we claimed before. The fourth element is the help of the international community, and we do suggest to our Belarusian partners that the OSCE, of which we European and Western allies are partners, of which Belarus is a partner and a member, and Russia too, could become the platform for seeking a peaceful solution and the start of a transition which will be negotiated among all of the political factions in Belarus. That for us in Poland would seem to be the best option as a way forward. Thanks very much. I will stop here and allow everyone to comment or to give more advices to all of us.
Thank you very much, Jan. And let me just then start where you ended. As a former OSCE official who spent 12 years in the organization, I can only agree that it should play a key role at this particular moment in time. And of course, we know also, congratulations, Poland, for taking up the Troika, for joining in the being the next chair of the OSCE, basically, now that Sweden has taken the helm and you're next in line. But I do have a question in the chat specifically on the OSCE from Jaap de Zwaan. Jaap, I would like to give you the floor. If you could unmute yourself and ask your question directly, then I think it's a good follow-up to what Jan was just saying.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, yes.
Yeah, you can. Okay, no, I think indeed that is something which has struck me from the beginning, actually. So everybody is aware that Belarus is I think the only European state is not a member of the Council of Europe and not a contracting party to the European Convention. However, it is a member of the OSCE, so bound to recommendations, standards, and what have you. Now, certainly we are all aware that for a long time, the OSCE has been hindered by the fact that on top positions, the nominations got stuck because of political problems, etc., etc. Nevertheless, it is the only international organization having its seat here in Europe, Western Europe, in Vienna, who could become active. And I think in this particular case, in light of the violations, the structural violations of human rights, fundamental freedom, which took place in Belarus, should take action one way or the other, whether you have a appointee as the Secretary General or not, but should have done something. And I have been particularly rather disappointed that for a long time there was no sign of any activity coming from Vienna. And I think now, since there have been these new nominations taking place, what can we expect them to do more? I would like to see a kind of mission taking place, perhaps also by involving, that's another question I have, why not involve more actively President Putin in this matter? Because everybody is aware that although, of course, he doesn't govern the country, but he can exercise a certain influence on the situation in Belarus. Why not OSCE could try to mobilize also the Russian partner in order to change the situation? So that is my question. And in fact, perhaps, Bob, if you allow, my second question is indeed about the European Union. Why should we not involve more clearly the Russian president in this discussion? Because for us, there is not that much to to lose by trying to involve him. Everybody's aware that if he has a willingness to do something, it could be very effective. So why not at least make an effort? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jaap, for these two questions. The second one we will also address in more detail after the break. We have two experts that I've prepared also on the role of the EU and any relations with the Russian Federation. If you permit me, I'd like to split it up, the first question in two parts, and ask Jan to reflect briefly on the OSCE, given also Poland's role now in the Troika and as future chairman. And in particular, Jan, if you would think about this consensus, the paralyzing consensus principle, because of course, the only non-consensual mechanisms are the institutions who were beheaded effectively, and the Moscow mechanism. But now maybe with a new SG in place, maybe there are things that could be done. And then Ambassador Latushka, if you could take also Jaap's part of the question on the role of the Russian Federation, because I know that you have also made statements on the role that Russia could play. And if you could give us a little bit insight on that, then I will start with Jan on the OSCE.
Thank you very much. I think these questions are so interlinked that we will not escape reflecting on Russia's role in all of the crisis. And here I just want to, I'm sorry that I will overstep a bit the question. I just want to say that thanking Jaap very much for this punch we just got for not involving President Putin. I just want to reflect on the fact that we are willing to support a sovereign, independent, and democratic Belarus, with the words, the semantic of the sovereign and independent, for me entails anyone, including the OSCE, the EU, and member states, reaching out to Belarus first and offering Belarus OSCE's good services, for instance. This has been done. Let me remind you that Prime Minister Rama, so the previous chairman of the OSCE before Sweden took it from Albania, tried to reach out to Aliaksandr Lukashenka offering mediation services. Second element, Sweden has done the same, but apparently I am shedding some light into the kitchen of OSCE diplomacy. Aliaksandr Lukashenka didn't pick up the phone. So it might happen that we are forced to call Moscow, but this would mean that we accept the role of a third country interfering in internal Belarusian affairs. We want this not to happen. That is why we are addressing any of our initiatives to Lukashenko and the regime and not to a third party, which we claim shouldn't be involved in seeking the solution.
Yeah.
Again, and this brings me to the question. I do think the OSCE is an excellent platform precisely because we are all there, including Russia, on equal footing. But on equal footing means Belarus has equal rights to any other member. It has also its obligations, of course. This is why the OSCE, in Poland's perception, is best placed to flag to those obligations. And this is why we support Professor Benedek and his report. And we think that, and I can shed even more light to the internal kitchen, we think that there will be a follow-up to the proposals which were put in the report of Professor Benedek, because OSCE member states are willing to give it a try to build on this report.
Okay, thank you. And just for the non-OSCE initiated, Professor Benedek was the rapporteur within the context of the Moscow mechanism, who wrote a highly recommended read, actually, very impressive given that he had no access to the country, how he did it. But it's recommended reading for anyone more interested in the subject matter. But Ambassador Latushka and Ambassador Ostapenko, I'd like to give the floor to you, because it's your country we're ultimately speaking about, to also give your reflections on the role of the OSCE and, as Jan mentioned, the role of the Russian Federation.
Thank you so much. Today is not a situation when we have a geopolitical choice to decide if we want to be together with European Union or we want to be together with Russian Federation. Today we have a pro-Belarusian protest in Belarus. We are fighting for the principles, for the standards of the democracy and human rights. And we are not telling about foreign political priorities to be more closer with Russia or to be more closer with the European Union. It is a common position of the Belarusian society. It is not a position of the democratic movement or democratic opposition in Belarus. It is a consensus in our society. But of course, people are asking more and more questions towards for the Russian partners if they want to continue their to assistance to their regime, to Lukashenko personally, or if they want to have a closer, wider dialogue with the democratic society. And it is. It seems to me it's a great misunderstanding among the political Russian leaders that if they will continue their dialogue only with Lukashenko's, in one day they can lose a lot. But not today, but in the future, I'm sure in 100% that it will be. So for today's mediation procedures, we see several open options. First of all, possibility to organize dialogue with participation of the European Union, Russia, probably United States, using the platform of OSCE, because all of these countries are members of the OSCE. Second option is if Russia will simultaneously be active in the process of this dialogue. But of course, it's a question of the guarantees. Democratic movement of Belarus want to have these guarantees, and our guarantees, it is involvement on this process, European Union and OSCE in that situation. Maybe my colleague will help me.
Not much. Indeed, we agree. The OSCE is the only organization when all influential partners participate, and we do recognize the influence of Russia to the events in Belarus. We do recognize the influence of the European Union for the development of Belarus. Potentially, we see the influence of the United States in this process. What we are looking for is the political decision and all the influence that can be used to force the authorities in Belarus to sit at this negotiating table, because it takes efforts. Because you mentioned that mild attempts, previous attempts have been rejected. Lukashenko didn't react on any proposals or any calls, any demands that have been worded in different declarations. So we need to find another procedures to go along the way towards the peaceful and inclusive dialogue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And there is one follow-up question by Hugo Klein, my colleague from the Clingendael Institute, that is asking about exactly the staying power of the opposition, which is so important in order to keep up the pressure. Hugo, if you could unmute yourself and ask this question.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, my question is about the stamina of actually the Belarusian population. And I wondered if you have clear indications that they are once again prepared to take to the streets in the same massive proportions that they have done before. For instance, during this announced constitutional reform process, because I guess the longer Lukashenko sits it out, and the police maintain their brutal practices, the enthusiasm may dwindle to take to the streets again. I myself witnessed in Belgrade at the time under Milosevic that there was also an up and down, and at some point the demonstrations were virtually gone, only later to be rekindled. But I was wondering how the Belarusian situation looks right now. Thank you.
Yeah, ambassadors, I can imagine it's difficult for you to stay in touch even with people, given that you're not able to travel to the country. But how do you assess the possibility for the sustained protest that Hugo asked about?
With your permission, I try to
Sure, with pleasure.
Think over the possible answer. We believe that the protests and the protest potential is still there. Although it's difficult to expect thousands of people to go out of their homes every weekend, every Sunday, you know, the conditions of winter in our country. But we have a lot of information proving that practically in all the corners of the capital, in different other cities of Belarus, people are going out now, in spite of all the repressions and all the hostile actions taken by the police. They are doing this not only on Sundays, but practically every day during the week, and they are determined to do it. That's one point. On the other point, we are noticing very harsh and very rigid decisions of the authorities. For example, today the Lukashenka signed new version of the administrative code that provides for stricter penalties to those who are participating in the peaceful process. And we may imagine that the pressure on the civil society will go up. The intention of the authorities is really to halt any protest activity, at least in the streets, but they cannot stop it in the hearts, I would say. Mm-hmm. So we expect that the people of Belarus would still be demanding fair elections and would fight for their right to have genuine leaders heading the country.
So Lukashenko don't want to have any dialogue, any kind of dialogue in the country. He wants to stop any protest activities on the streets, not only the streets. He closed newspapers and he doing other steps, very crucial. But when he will stop the process, and difficult to imagine that Belarusian people will be years on the street. So if we are having such question from the European Union institution, how long it will be protest in Belarus? So maybe you're waiting that it will be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Is it possible? Yes, it is possible. But is it real? Maybe not. So nobody knows. But if he using all the instruments of repressions to stop any protest activities, so it's necessary to react, because the people not change their views. It will be less possibilities to be on the streets, but they not change their views. But of course that we are waiting in the spring, or maybe earlier, that it will be massive protest actions on Belarus. I'm sure in 100% that people want to go to the streets in to the march and to show the Lukashenko their unit and they want to struggle. But it will be again repressions. When, for example, Mr. Fazer was in Minsk and he said that he wanted probably to organize the World Cup of hockey in Minsk, we said, please, okay, you can organize, but the first day of this World Cup will be the greatest, the biggest manifestation in Minsk. And we will see how Lukashenko will react on this great protest actions on the first day of World Cup, when it will be international reporters, international journalists, and etc., etc.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think also the point was very clearly made by the protesters that they do have the anger and the courage to continue returning to the streets if there is a moment to do that. They may not do that in the same numbers every week anymore. But the signal that came also when they last took to the streets is that still the regime hasn't suddenly gained in legitimacy. The problem has not gone away just because the people are not on the street every week. But I think their message was heard loud and clear. And that courage is unbelievable, I have to say. I have tons of other questions in the chat, but some of them are actually better addressed at the panelists, including those by Alina and Harry on the impact of the sanctions. Actually, there's a very intriguing question by Natalia Mirimanova on the inter-ethnic situation. Natalia, I would add also the Polish minority to that question. So I want to give that question the last one, and also to address that also to Jan, and then take a quick break and switch to the panel. So Natalia, the floor is yours. If you could unmute yourself. Can you,
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yes. Loud and clear.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bob, and thank you very much, all the presenters, and kudos to the Belarusian protest. It's in my personal capacity. In my professional capacity as a senior political advisor to the High Commission of National Minorities, I would like to ask the question about this intriguing, mythical Belarusian unity across linguistic lines, ethnic lines, religious lines. It's truly seems to be a Belarusian phenomenon. However, there is a danger that sort of a national minority card could be played. And in particular, I'm talking about the Russian Federation, who does it in some other countries, as you know. One of the expressions by the Foreign Minister Lavrov about the Belarusization of Belarus was quite alarming to me. My question to you is, how do you think we collectively could help this Belarusian unity to be more resilient to these types of external pressures, real or imagined? For instance, Lukashenko makes his usual irresponsible statements about the Poland trying to infringe on Belarusian sovereignty and annex Grodno and the region. But I'm more interested in how do you see the prospects of this cross-ethnic, cross-linguistic, and cross-religious unity to be sustained, and what can be done to help with that? Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. Very difficult question, I may add, but those are the questions that HCNM has to deal with. Ambassador Latushka, you were also Minister of Culture, so I think you're in a good position to answer this question on the importance of identity and language, because of course the flag used by the protesters is also in a way an expression of identity, a historical symbol as well. Could you have a stab at Natalia's question?
Again, it's not a question of identity today on this movement. We are not talking about the situation of minorities, Russian minority, or Polish minority, or other minorities in Belarus. Because if we will see on the activists of these protest movements, among them also as Belarusians, the same also Russian and Polish people. So I'd like to stress you again and to show you again that we have a common unity and we are united, and it's not a question of the dividing of the society on this question. The dividing only that maybe 15–20% of the citizens of our country accept the policy of Lukashenko. But again, its acceptation is rather, if they will look to the years before, not for today's situation. It's a normal situation in democratic society. We are not democratic, but it's normal if they have their views and they are very happy of the presidency of Lukashenko during last 26 years. But we are not divided on that questions. Of course, the propaganda, they try to show this problem, but it's they want to show it
artificially.
Artificially, but not in reality exists.
Yeah. Okay. Very clear. Thank you. I am slightly over the time, but I would be amiss if I wouldn't give Jan the opportunity to make some concluding remarks before we move on to the panel, because also Grodno has been mentioned. Jan, floor is yours.
Hey, hello. Not because of Grodno, but just because of the fact that Miriam has asked a wonderful question, and I want to use this opportunity to put my feet into this mud. On one hand side, you can hear President Lukashenko, Aliaksandr Lukashenko, or regime officials accusing constantly foreign powers of interference. Depending on the day of the week, it might be Poland, Lithuania, Germany, Russia, that changes. But one element is very important. In no instance any minority has been mentioned as the source of instability. That's very important. On one hand side, no one is playing against the unity of the nation inside of Belarus. I think it's a very important point to make when you observe the situation. And the second one is yours, Bob. Look at the flags waved during the demonstrations. The protesters are not waving the EU flag. No. Nor are they waving the Russian flag. They are demonstrating under the historical flag of Belarus. This is also very symbolic. And this is the difference to the situation in Ukraine, And I think this is also a lesson that Russia, for instance, has learned from Ukraine. Overplaying on these differences can backfire. So I think, Miriam, we shouldn't be that much afraid of losing the unity of the Belarusian people here, frankly speaking. Thank you.
Excellencies, ambassadors, thank you. Oh, Ambassador Tushka, yes.
That if Russia will continue that policy that they realize now in Belarus, in near future, it will be European flags in manifestations, among manifestations in Belarus.
Yeah, actually that supports Jan's argument of playing the long game and waiting and having strategic patience. But now I owe to the other speakers in the panel the opportunity to also go into depth on their respective areas of expertise. So Jan, Ambassador Tushka, Ambassador Stephenka, I'd very much like to thank you for your insights. I also like to thank those of you who asked very good and provocative questions. And I was originally planning to have a short break so anybody can go out and grab a quick drink. But I would like to move straight on in the interest of time to the panel and introduce our next speakers. Inge, if you could make the arrangements, then it is my pleasure to introduce Vitis Jurkonis, who is in, I think you're here in your capacity from the Institute of International Relations and Political Science from University of Vilnius, but you're also program director for Freedom House, and you've been very closely involved. From the very beginning, you've been monitoring the protests. You've played an active role from the Lithuanian side. Before this, you were actually at the Vilnius-based think tank Eastern European Studies Center. So Vitis, thank you very much for joining us. And our second panelist is Tony van der Tocht, who's a senior research associate with the Clingendael Institute and also a senior official at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he worked on the Eastern Europe and Central Asia region in all kinds of factions. You were head of the division. You were also at several embassies and consulates in the region. And you're one of our long-term commentators on Belarus, including in our previous webinar when we looked ahead at what we might expect. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining for this second half. Vitis, if I could start with you to just pick it up where we left it in the previous part on your forecast going forward, because what we've seen is that Lukashenko has become more and more reliant on repression and therefore on the security services, the Siloviki, not necessarily the army, but very much the secret services and the interior ministry forces, in order to stay in power. Now, we've just heard before the break, or the lack of break actually, that he might be going on for a while this way. Are there no cracks showing in that facade? Can he string this out for another year as he tries to do a type of constitutional cosmetic reform? Or how do you assess the stability going forward? The floor is yours, Vitis.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invite. And I think that the very panel that you have is actually an example that there are some cracks. The two speakers from Belarus are showing that not everyone, even among the former Belarusian officials, are okay with that kind of policy. And the same applies not only to those who work in the field of the foreign affairs or the culture, but also among the security forces. Again, it's a question, how massive is this? And initially it looked like it might be pretty dramatic, but the way how the Belarusian authorities are acting now, I think that, well, their main goal is to make sure that the majority of the active people leave the country right away, and that they are not messing around in their understanding. That kind of strategy worked out pretty well before in 2006, in 2010, but I think that they are not taking into consideration how massive the protest is, and it's like going across the board. I mean, people in the left, in the right, people in the capital or the main cities and in the regions. This unity issue was mentioned. I mean, it really doesn't matter whether you are a Belarusian speaking, a Russian speaking, you are an Orthodox, a Catholic, a non-believer. People are fed up with this system. I know that brings also me to to the main question of this discussion regarding this uncertainty. I think that when it comes to the Belarusian people, I think they are rather certain and determined that enough is enough. and there is much more less certainty among us, meaning the international community, for various reasons. We've been playing with the regime. We know that, well, we are used to work much more with the officials rather than the civil society. Even you, when you were asking questions, it looked like, you know, there was a question about the Belarusian people. You are speaking about the opposition, you know, and this is not the same thing, you know, because people who are out there in the streets, they are usually like not representing any institutions, or they are not necessarily belonging to the oppositional parties. You know, they are demanding one thing and one only, is free and fair elections, their choice. Mm-hmm. I think that the West in this regard did a couple of steps to the right direction. We didn't recognize the elections. We agreed very quickly, I dare to say, on OSCE Moscow mechanism to investigate the human rights abuses. We imposed sanctions, but once we did the first step, not recognizing the elections and basically not recognizing Lukashenko, the fundamental question is, so what next? Are we recognizing Svetlana Tikhanovskaya as the president-elect? And I think that even she doesn't really want to be recognized as the president-elect. So then the next obvious step is to not leave this vacuum and say that the new free and fair elections need to be happening and sooner rather than later, because otherwise it's us who are contributing to that uncertainty. And I think this should be the goal, the focus of the international community. And let's not contribute to that uncertainty, but do quite the opposite and be very clear that we do not have any preferences regarding Latushka, Tikhanovskaya, I don't know, Babarika, Tsevkala, or Lukashenko. We are standing for principles of democracy and human rights. And there was a question and a few points made on the OSCE. So since Helge Schmidt is the Secretary General at the OSCE, there's a Swedish presidency, and I couldn't think of a better, perhaps, country in terms of the neutral stand regarding the processes. I think it's a big task for Swedish presidency and the international community, ODIHR, which is in charge of the elections, to make sure that these elections are happening in spring 2021. Otherwise, we would be part of that uncertainty. And I think it's pretty clear that Lukashenko is there for 26 years. It's pretty clear that he is illegit according to the democratic standards for more than 15 years. It was not pretty clear whether like he has public support, but now it's clear that he doesn't have that public support. So the question is on us, like, because it's neither Pavel Latushka nor Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, they are not voting, they do not have a right to vote at the OSCE, nor at the UN, nor any other European parliament for that matter, right? So it's us who are voting, it's us who are imposing sanctions. So we need to be much more determined. And from the questions that were asked or already raised to this discussion, I think regarding Russia, like, well, I can say one thing for sure. Russia, Kremlin, will not be bringing democracy to the region and certainly not to Belarus. And Kremlin is the problem, not the solution of the situation in Belarus. So whenever I hear that argument about what about Russia, it sounds more like an excuse to do nothing or very little, to say that we are not able to. So if we are not able to actually do anything, or we don't have confidence, or we are uncertain that democracy, elections, like free and fair elections, are the principles that we are standing by, then we can simply shut the entire conversation and say, and not imitate that we are concerned or ask questions what are going the Belarusian people to do. Is like, you know, they can coming every single weekend for years. For what purpose? You know, if the international community is basically not living to its standards. So yeah, that's more a question on us.
That is very much, you summarized this conundrum that we found ourselves in, and those working in those international organizations undoubtedly have the same feeling, is that I think the end goal that everybody asks for is clear, free and fair elections, but the means to get to that goal are actually quite difficult. And that brings us to the question I wanted to ask Tony, because we've tried, all of us actually, except Lukashenko, tried very hard to say this is not a geopolitical crisis. It was not an East versus West. The population didn't go to the streets, as Ambassador Latushka said, with flags of the European Union, although they might do so in the future. But there is a geopolitical overlay, whether or not we like it. And this is also part of this broader EU engagement with Russia question. Now, Tony, if I could give you the floor, and also to add to the complexity, that point that was made by Jan about if we engage with Russia, we de facto accept that it has a role, a sort of privileged role. And of course, legally, it does have a certain status, the union state, that it might call upon to solve some of the problems. But it is a devilish dilemma. So, Tony, the floor is yours to try and shed some light on how we could engage.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bob, and great to be here at this panel. Indeed, what for the EU, we were trying to frame the developments in Belarus as not a geopolitical battle. So we didn't want this to be a new Maidan, but what we looked at was more the situation in Armenia, where there was a peaceful transition from below by the population, by civil society, without these external players coming into action. So there was no intervention from Moscow. Of course, Belarus is not Armenia, also not for Moscow. And so whatever we do and whatever we did, trying to convince also the Russian Federation that this was not geopolitical, that there were no EU flags, that we didn't want Belarus to become part of the EU, let alone NATO, Russia would anyhow see this as geopolitical. Anything which is about democratic rights, which looks like a color revolution, which is like a revolution of dignity, like it was also in Belarus, for the Kremlin, this is geopolitical, whatever we do. So recognizing that fact and recognizing also that, I mean, we have only, as EU, we have limited leverage on the regime in Belarus. Okay, we can try some sanctions, but Moscow has much more leverage in this situation. So already very early on, it was therefore that Angela Merkel and Macron and Charles Michel, they all called President Putin. Also because President Lukashenko was not picking up the phone. So all efforts to get into a dialogue with the regime in Minsk was stalled from the very beginning. So then you move to the next best option and try to find those who have leverage, who have more leverage, and who maybe could press Lukashenko to accept, well, for example, this national dialogue and an inclusive national dialogue. And we all know that Putin doesn't really like Lukashenko. So, I mean, what they have been trying, and that's also the long game, they have been trying to use this political transition, constitutional reform type of process to develop alternatives to Lukashenko, to have some kind of pro-Russian political parties, and to have them involved in this process. So to have a gradual transition, but controlled by Moscow. And that was also why any effort to reach out to Moscow and to convince them, for example, to involve OSCE was rebuffed, because it would mean, well, losing this type of control. So both Lukashenko, who was also playing the geopolitical card with Putin, and the Russian Federation have been trying to keep the West out, to keep the EU out, to keep OSCE out, to keep the US out. So then a question comes up, can we simply somehow redress this situation and convince Moscow that it may also be in their long-term interest to move into a direction where you have a national and inclusive dialogue. Because if you don't have that, if you have only a kind of national all Belarusian assembly, which represents, well, what? Part of the nomenclatura maybe still, but for the rest, not really the Belarusian population, you will never get to a sustainable solution. And I think in the end, Moscow also would like to have stability and not, they've calculated that, well, maybe these demonstrations will go away. Well, it didn't happen. And it still won't happen, I think. And I think we should support the Belarusian opposition as much as we can to be able to continue. Because this can convince maybe the regime at a certain stage or Moscow that by supporting this illegitimate regime, and there are some surveys, sociological surveys done that, okay, the population wasn't anti-Russian, wasn't in a certain sense pro-European either. But now gradually, as people see that Putin is supporting this regime of Lukashenko, supporting the repression, it can come to a point where there is a growing anti-Russian opposition within Belarus. And if Russia sees this happening, I think they may change, it may change their calculus. Another thing which may change their calculus is the economic and the financial factor. And therefore, it's, I think, very good, the initiative with Poland took to show also to the Belarusian population at large what may be on the agenda, a Marshall Plan or whatever you call it, once there is a democratic Belarus in place. And for Russia at the moment, okay, they have supported financially Lukashenko, but partly to simply repay debts to Russian companies. Russian companies may still make use of the weak negotiating position to take over more assets in Belarus, but it doesn't help Russia in the longer term. It may only stimulate anti-Russian feelings, and it may also raise the financial costs. Which eventually they would like, I think, also the economic community and the EU and other international donors to share, and not only to have that on Moscow's account. So therefore, I think strategic patience is really the word. We should play the long game. We should realize that this will not change overnight. We should keep up the pressure. And we should keep up messaging also to Moscow that it may not be in their long-term interest to continue the present course and to work through the OEC. I think the OEC is the best bet to get the OEC involved here in this process. And we are helped by one other element, and then I finish up.
Thank you, Tony.
Yeah, no, I saw your signal. That is that we may, with the incoming Biden administration, the EU may also have a more active partner in the US in trying to change this situation, because, well, the EU-Russia dialogue is at a very low level at the moment. So don't expect too much of that. The US has, for a long time, not been involved, not very much. I mean, people close to Biden, yes, they've been tweeting. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has been invited to the inauguration of Biden. So maybe, although Belarus will not be the highest on the agenda of the next administration, but maybe US would like to become more involved, and they are also part of the OEC. So maybe EU and US working together can put some more pressure and can also signal to Russia that they may have to change tack. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Tony. There was a lot there. Of course, Biden, with his summit of democracies and his strong pro-democracy message, would indeed we would expect something also within the context of the OSCE. But you mentioned pressure, and one of the instruments to exercise pressure has been the sanctions, even though the EU struggled to come to agreement on them. And I have not one, but two questions on sanctions from Alina and Harry. Now, Harry, if you permit, since you added to Alina's question, I would give Alina the floor to ask it, and then consider your part included in that. Alina, the floor is yours. If this works, yes.
Yes, okay. Yeah, sorry, it's the first time I'm in this format. So my name is Alina Belska, and I have a question regarding sanctions. There are a lot of discussions, and today there was an article in Belarusian press basically stating that sanctions have had an impact on both the businesses and private individuals, despite the fact that, of course, you have also seen quite significant critique against the weakness of the sanctions, or very few people being on the sanctions against entities being removed at the last moment. So my question is, how do you see the effectiveness and the impact of the sanctions, and what's next?
Yeah. And then adding Harry's component, also the willingness of the EU to greatly expand the sanctions program. And he says, including economic sanctions. Tony, if you take this one, then I have another one stored up for Vitis.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think sanctions have always several different purposes. They can be there to punish, let's say, to punish those who violated the elections, or to punish human rights violators. But sanctions can also be there to build up pressure to change the situation. So more like a political type of sanctions, which sometimes have only long-term effects. So yes, I mean, EU has gradually been building up sanctions. Now the first economic entities are included. I heard also today that from the side of the Coordination Council, whereas at first they didn't want to have economic sanctions, real economic sanctions, only the type of more symbolic ones, because of the effects they would have on the economic situation in Belarus in general and on the Belarusian population at large. Some of these targeted sanctions on economic entities and on individual oligarchs supporting the regime of Lukashenka, that could be expanded in principle. I would always recommend for this to be effective also to look very closely at what to coordinate this with the US. That would make sanctions much more effective. It would also raise the price, the financial price for Russia, for the Russian Federation, if it wants to go ahead and, let's say, take over some of those entities in Belarus, as they have been doing in the past as well. But here as well, I mean, you don't expect very quick results here. This is not a kind of fast solution, because the regime very much realizes that whatever this type of pressure, I mean, they are fighting for survival. So they are not really willing to take these economic and financial factors rationally into account. I mean, their problem is, so it could lead to more dependence on Russia. So then you come back to the question of, well, is this in the long-term Russian interest? And could Russia at a certain time not say, okay, but stop it, this is going to cost us too much, directly or indirectly?
That is actually interesting also in light of a question that Julius asked. And I'd like to give Julius the floor and ask it to Vitis on this, how long the regime can survive from an economic point of view, because that is, of course, an Achilles heel, if you will, of the regime. Julius, floor is yours.
Yes, hello, do you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. Sorry, for me it's also the first time when we're using such kind of system. So actually, I would like to come back to, or to continue the question on economic sanctions, and just to ask a little bit broader. What, in your opinion, economic perspectives of Belarus as a whole? In other words, how long the existing regime could survive using their current assets? Because, for example, when we know that Belarus in the beginning of 2020 had around 11 billion of gold and foreign currency assets. At the end of 2020, it had around $7 billion US dollars of gold and foreign current assets. So in Europe, any predictions how long it could continue in terms of money?
That's a pretty good one. I'm actually very curious, Vitus, do you have any insights on this?
Yeah, well, economic situation, like bad economic situation, was part of the problems why the protest emerged, alongside, of course, the mismanagement of the COVID situation, the rise of the social networks, and the election fraud, right? So economic situation is not great, but we need to also say that Belarusian economy is something like a drug addict relying on the Russian, like Kremlin subsidies. So it's basically a question if Russia is able to provide the subsidies, even the ineffective economy can't survive. But I mean, when they were switching off the internet, a lot of companies from the IT sector are moving out, relocating to the other countries, Poland, Lithuania, EPAM, wargaming, like some of those which were kind of the pride of the Belarusian IT industry. And that's all part of the problem. So economic situation is not great, but can they, and I'm hearing signals from the Belarusian population, especially in the regions, teachers who are not receiving salaries for 2 months or their salaries are being cut. So of course, this dissatisfaction is going to even grow. And that's a question to, again, relating to the sanctions. I think sanctions are playing a role, but the first round of the EU sanctions was more to punish those who participated in the election fraud. The second round was more those who were perpetrators of the or participants of the human rights abuses. The third was kind of hinting to some economic sanctions, and every one of us knows whom to target. Basically, if we want to punish, not only punish but put pressure. People around Bremeno Group and the so-called, Lukashenko's pockets. So if we want to do that, but again, one is to announce sanctions and the other is to implement. And this is not an easy job, right? Because the other side is also skillful moving money around. So I think that generally we need to be much more precise in terms of who's who in Belarus. There are we don't know, we know usually a few names in Belarus, but when it comes to politically exposed persons of various lessons, do have that kind of databases, and Belarus is not very good at open data, even compared to Russia. So for us it's very hard to actually target those who are actually very close to the regime and doing basically stealing the money from the Belarusian people. But and we are coming back to this fundamental question of Russia. As I said, it is a problem, not a solution. One thing is that Putin's regime is terrified if the new free and fair elections are happening. What kind of signal does it send to the Russian population? I mean, it's not such a geopolitical question where is Belarus going, but it's more a question, what kind of signal is that sending to the Russian population? And again, if we, and I'm hearing this from the expert community very often, saying that we don't have much leverage. So, okay, if we admit that we don't have much leverage, perhaps the right thing is to do the right thing, not pretend that we have a lot of power, but let's stick to the principles. Let's save our face that we are actually sticking to the principles and do a right thing. Because when we are speaking about strategic patience, tell that to the Belarusian people. 26 years of strategic patience, where did that lead us, or led the Belarusian people? Enough is enough. That's what signaling the Belarusian people, and I hope that we are hearing the signal and we are not repeating the lessons or the mistakes of the past, of the 2009-10, this engagement and all these Minsk dialogues and all of that imitation, because that was imitation, and we need to be very loud and clear about that.
Okay, That is indeed a loud and clear message. Martijn, I think that also answers your question on the impact of democratization in Belarus on Russia itself. But there is one question that I would actually love to know the answer to, and it's going to be asked by Laura Staring on potential replacements, also from the Kremlin's point of view. Laura, the question, and the floor is yours, actually.
Thank you, Bob. Yes, as we all know, the Kremlin is also getting very fed up with Lukashenko. Now, the question, of course, is, do they have an alternative? If you read Russian media, the mainstream media, then there are more and more critical articles that openly state that the Kremlin is missing the boat. Tikhanovskaya in the beginning has been very, she has tried to be neutral and not taking any political stance, because she knows, and the whole opposition knows, that Belarus is tied to Russia, economically speaking, very much. So, but more and more people are telling the Kremlin that, you know, if you continue in this vein, then you will miss the boat, and she will be forced to side with the European Union. So my question is, and I don't know if Mr. Latushko is still around.
I hope he is.
Be interested in his opinion also. Does the Kremlin have an alternative for Lukashenko? We have seen leaked documents by the insider that show that the Kremlin is very concerned about Lukashenko's behavior, and they would like to get rid of him. But those papers are pretty archaic, and they make a very clumsy impression. Do you have any signs that there is any outreach towards you?
Ambassador Stepenka, I see that the webcam has come back on and that it's dark where you are now by now. As we are in the last minutes of the webinar, I'd like to give you, and if he's still there, Ambassador Latushka, the floor to make some concluding remarks, also to answer Laura's question on possible alternatives palatable to the Kremlin before we conclude. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Mr. Latushka left for another engagement, so I will be acting on his behalf. And I use this opportunity to thank you for really very interesting and very thought-provoking events. And I'm really impressed by the deep knowledge of the situation on part of your experts, and what is more important, by the determination of the speakers to get the task done. And this encourages us, because we are determined to go on, and we will make our part of the road, our half of the road. Coming back to the question, and it's a big question indeed, and it was asked already earlier, is there a candidate of Russia to be put as the participant of the presidential race? Why don't we ask, is there a candidate of the European Union? And we are asking ourselves, do we have enough candidates for this very important job? And I may assure you that we do have these candidates, and I'm sure you that this should be a candidate of Belarusian candidate of the Belarusian choice, and this would be the candidate who would speak respectfully both with Russia and with the West, and would pursue the policy in the interest of the Belarusian people. So let's keep to the determination to maintain sovereignty and independence of our country, and I believe that the people of Belarus will make the right choice. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Jan, I saw your camera come back on. Do you want to make any concluding remarks before we wrap up our webinar? Yep.
I just want to thank both embassies and the participants, and especially those who tried to listen to us and understand what we want to pass. I hope that we made our point clear. Belarus needs to remain high on the European agenda. This is our not only our neighbor, but this is a very important country on the European map, which should stand sovereign, independent, and hopefully democratic in the nearest future. Thank you very much, Bob, for everything.
Thank you very much, Jan. And then there, I think that is the shared topic of all of us, the importance of keeping it on the agenda, because the very worst that could happen is that people now forget about Belarus. So all the courage that was shown by the people on the streets who had to face this repression would be in vain. And I think that is the small contribution that we can make as Clingendael Institute, together with the embassies and together with anybody else who wants to cooperate with us, to make sure that people have access to continuous information about it, to that expertise that exists in the region, to bring that also to our Dutch audience. And I'm very glad that this webinar could make that modest contribution. So with gratitude to all the speakers, to all the respective ambassadors in all the different cities, and all of those that were involved in the very complicated preparations for this particular webinar, including my colleagues back home at the Clingendael Institute who had to make this happen. Thank you, everyone, and I wish you a nice remainder of your day. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in our future events.